Mendoza?
Here.
Mendoza here. Stone? Here. Stone here. Jackson? Here. Jackson. Leno?
Here.
Here. Mitchell. We have a quorum.
Great, thank you. And we have a special order, item number SB3, that will be beginning with Mr. Leno. As he proceeds, we're going to just announce that SB 730 Welker has been pulled from today's meeting. We'll be hearing that at our next meeting. And we have a sign-in order, so we'll have the rest of the presenters to go ahead and sign in. We'll take them in that order. Go ahead, Senator Leno, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee members, I'm joined this morning by my joint author and our new colleague, Senator Levy. We're so pleased to have her as a joint author. So as we know, President Obama has said that income inequality is the defining challenge of our time. And the fact is that wages are growing at the very slowest rate relative to corporate profits in the history of our country. Median wage has been stagnant over the last 30 years. 65% of workers are working paycheck to paycheck. Millions of Californians impacted by our minimum wage are living in poverty and will continue to live in poverty even when we get to our incremental success under AB 10 to $10 an hour next year. And they all, by definition, qualify for public assistance, which is why folks such as Mitt Romney and Bill O'Reilly and Ron Unz and other conservative thought leaders support raising the federal minimum wage to $10.10 with a cost of living adjuster. And when asked his opinion of the president's proposal to raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10, Bill O'Reilly's comment was, no big deal. When an employer pays an employee a poverty wage, qualifying for public assistance, that means that the taxpayer is subsidizing the private employer's responsibility for his or her workers' basic human needs, housing, food, and medical care. And that's why these conservative thought leaders disapprove of paying poverty wages. Fact is, you and I and all of us here are subsidizing the wealthiest family on the planet Earth, the Walton family, worth over $100 billion because they pay their workers so little that they qualify for public assistance. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but to Walmart's credit, they will be raising their own minimum wage as high as California's next year. Additionally, 70% of our economy is based on consumer spending. That is just a fact. And of course, workers at the bottom of our economy are spending every dollar that they earn just to keep food on the table and a roof over their head. And none of this goes to overseas bank accounts. These are dollars that are recirculated in the economy immediately. And when workers have more dollars in their pockets to spend on their daily needs, there's an increase in demand for goods and services. When there's an increase for demand for goods and services, that's when employers have to hire more employees to meet that demand. And that's what economists call a virtuous upward cycle. That's what we want. Currently, though, we're in a stagnant pattern, if not a vicious cycle downward, where we've put such constraints on the middle class that it's shrinking and shrinking, putting more and more people into poverty. And we've seen our poverty rates increase as the top 1% has garnered 95% of all the economic benefits since the recovery started in 2009. And this, of course, is bad for consumer spending, and our economy suffers. And employers actually don't hire and potentially fire. As I mentioned, the CEO of Walmart, Doug McMillon, explains minimum wage increases are an investment. Walmart, the largest private sector employer in the United States, has invested in a $10 minimum wage for its employees with the expected return of increased profits. Smart. Henry Ford knew the same thing. Paid his employees far beyond any of his competitors. Why? He wanted them to be able to buy his automobiles. This will come through worker retention, better ability to attract skilled workers, and increase customer service because of employee satisfaction. And the experts with me today will demonstrate that Mr. McMillan's business decision is supported by extensive research. We will hear all sorts of debate on this study, that study. This is what minimum wage increases do. This is what it doesn't do. You'll hear some reference to the Congressional Budget Office's study recently, and it has been used to document that the nation would take a 500,000 employee hit if the president's $10.10 proposal went forward. But in fact, what they actually said was that many studies find no significant impact of, and I'm quoting from the CBO. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm quoting from Goldman Sachs's Michael Cahill and David Miracle. They wrote, in our view, the CBO's recent estimate of a $500,000 hit to the level of employment is likely a bit toward the upper end of reasonable estimates, both because many studies find no significant impact of minimum wage hikes on employment, and because the offsetting boost to demand is likely to be larger than usual at this present time. They go on to say, and these are the two folks from Goldman Sachs, that the effect of the increase on minimum wage, in their words, on job numbers as well as inflation would probably be on the small side. So we can live by all the fears that you're going to hear in just a moment, or we can live by the actual data collected on past minimum wage increases. And I thought it might be of interest just to look at what has happened here in California, because, of course, we just raised our minimum wage. Maybe there's something we can learn from what's just happened in our own backyard. And I want to thank and credit Assemblyman Louis Alejo, who led the charge in raising our minimum wage from $8 an hour to $9 last July, with a $10 minimum wage coming in 2016. A very important step forward, but why we're here today is that even when we raise it to $10 an hour, which is where Walmart's going nationwide, and keep in mind the cost of living in California is 30% higher than in Alabama and other places across the country, where they will be paid $10 an hour, and that 30% differential would mean $13 an hour here, which is where our bill intends to get to. So it was a very important and incremental step forward, but our goal here is to make sure that it's no longer legal to pay a poverty wage in California. We want to lift people out of poverty. And so what has happened here in California? In July of 2014, the state's unemployment rate was 7.4%. That was the time when we increased our minimum wage from $8 an hour to $9 an hour. And of course, all the folks who are going to be opposing this bill today, traditionally and without exception, though they did agree to a deal on this most recent, but traditionally the line is job killer, and it will be there will be serious consequences to the economy that raises its minimum wage. So we were 7.4% in July of 14. California gained 27,700 non-farm jobs in July itself. So these gains were seen across all industry sectors, including leisure and hospitality. This trend continued in January of 15. California employers added 67,300 jobs, one of the largest single-month jump in the last 3 years. And the state's unemployment rate in February of 2015 dropped to 6.7%. So from 7.4% down to 6.7% in the very 7 months following the increase of our minimum wage. Now, I'm not stating that there is causation here, but there is minimally correlation and proof positive. This is not a job killer bill. These numbers become even more impressive when considering them on a national scale. The California jobs added in January accounted for about 28%, almost a third of all jobs created in the United States of America were created here in California, though we represent only 12% of the population, and we just increased our minimum wage. So, I will conclude by saying this proposal before us, which would increase California's minimum wage from $9 an hour to $11 an hour in January of 2016, with an increase 18 months later to $13 an hour in July of 2017, and 18 months after that, January 1st of 2019, tying it to CPI, will lift millions of people out of poverty. Our goal, again, is to get our minimum wage at least to the federal poverty line, which is about $24,000, around $300 for a family. $13 an hour would get us to about $26,000 a year, and then adjusted for CPI, so it doesn't fall below poverty again. Because we don't have a CPI right now, when we first established a minimum wage in California so many decades ago, it would be worth close to $11 an hour today. But we don't have a CPI, and we're at $9 an hour, meaning more and more people fall below the poverty line, and their minimum wage continually is diminished as inflation increases, putting more and more people on public assistance. If we value work, we have to pay for it. And so I'm pleased to pass the baton to my joint author, Senator Leyva, and we'll have responses to those in opposition later in my close. And after Senator Leyva, I would like to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Before you continue,
Yes.
Senator Leyva, there's some empty seats here in the front. If anybody in the back wants to have a seat, there's some over here and available. Please feel free to come forward. I don't think there'll be any members coming in anytime soon, so Senator Leyva, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator Leno. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me the opportunity to be here. I'm very excited to talk to you today about this bill. As many of you may know or may not know, I've spent the last 20 years of my life in the labor movement because I know, and I think many of you know, a good job fixes a lot of what ails us in society. Right now, the income gap is enormous. It's the biggest it's ever been. CEO pay is at an all-time high, while workers are falling farther and farther behind. And while we certainly respect our CEOs and we love to see companies do well and be successful, sometimes they forget that the people who show up and do the work day in and day out are the ones that are making them successful, and they are the ones that are making them the profits that they have. There's also a misunderstanding of who our minimum wage earners are. In the past, maybe when I was in high school, maybe when I was younger, minimum wage earners were people in high school, they were people in college. But if you go on the Department of Labor website, you will see that 88% of workers who earn minimum wage are 20 years of age or older. But you know that, because if you go to a fast food restaurant, if you go to a grocery store, you see that these jobs that were traditionally held by young people are now held by people who are sometimes my age, sometimes older, people who are trying to support a family on $9 an hour. And what is $9 an hour? If you're lucky enough to work 40 hours a week, $9 an hour is $360 a week, $1,440 a month, gross. That's before taxes. But most workers, most retail workers, do not get to work 40 hours a week. Most of them work about 28 hours a week, and most of us know the reason for that. So if you work 28 hours a week, you're going to gross $252 a week, and your monthly income will be $1,008 a week. Back to my statistic from the Department of Labor, the 88% of people who are over 20 working for minimum wage, 55% of those folks are women. So women are disproportionately hurt by a low income. So when we look at what a minimum wage earner makes, we can throw out numbers, but we also have to look at the reality of where folks live and how much it costs to live there. So in SD20, in my district, monthly housing or rent is between $1,116 a month or $1,318 a month. So if you're making $9 an hour and are lucky enough to work 40 hours, your gross is $1,440 a month. You don't even have enough money to pay for your rent, let alone eat, pay your utilities, and drive your car to work. When I was doing research on this issue, I wanted to have some facts for you. I know it's important, but facts are important as well. The Washington Post had a study that was done. It was kind of a little spoof on what you would how many hours you would have to work. So on September 2nd of 2014, they posted, renting and owning a home has become almost unaffordable. At the California minimum wage of $9 an hour, a person would have to work 18.6 hours per day, 7 days a week to afford their rent. So that's kind of interesting and really quite sad. And to Senator Leno's point, we really can't have it both ways. We can't keep people working in poverty and then be unhappy that they're using the social safety net. So either we make sure people can earn a living and support themselves and their families, or we're going to continue to put more money into the social safety net. So in closing, what I'd like to ask you to think about, I've given you a lot of numbers and statistics. Just think about your own income. Think about your household bills, your rent, your house payment, what it costs to feed your family. Maybe you even want your kids to be able to play soccer or baseball. And could you do that on $9 an hour? Because as a state senator, I'm no better than anyone else. I just have more responsibilities. And part of my responsibility is making sure everyone who works hard in the state of California can take care of their families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Reich, who is the director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley. We're going to start with Ken Jacobs, who is director of the UC Berkeley Labor Center, followed by Professor Reich. And then we also have Michael Harold, who's the legislative advocate with Western Center on Law and Poverty, who is the sponsor of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning. So as noted, I'm Ken Jacobs, chair of the UC Berkeley Center for Labor Research and Education. Appreciate you having me here today. I'm going to briefly present some of the results of a forthcoming profile we'll be putting out on low-wage work in California. And as noted, like the rest of the country, California has seen a steep growth in inequality since the late 1970s. Real wages have fallen by about 5% for median workers over the last 25 years, with greater declines for people in the bottom third of the workforce. And that's a time when productivity has risen about 89%, and earnings at the top have skyrocketed. So we've seen, during this time period, as Senator Leva mentioned, we've seen an important shift in the profile of low-wage work in California. And to define low-wage work in this study, we use a common definition, which is 2/3 of the median wage. That's $13.63 in 2014 dollars, a little above the proposed minimum wage here, but about where you'd expect, in the range you'd expect to see increases with indirect wage push, as well as people who receive direct increases from the minimum wage. So in 1979, about 16% of low-wage workers were teenagers. Today, teenagers make up about 5% of the low-wage workforce. In 1979, 29% of low-wage workers had less than high school education, and 39% had at least some college. Today, just 20% have less than a high school education, and almost half, 48%, have at least some college. The average low-wage worker in California now contributes 61% of their family's income. These are not people who are doing this as a job on the side to get a little extra income. 60% are in families below 200% of the federal poverty level. 40% have children of their own. That means you've got significantly more low-wage workers who have children of their own. It was 8 times as many than the ones who are themselves teenagers living with their parents. Less than a quarter receive health benefits through their employer. And as mentioned, there's greater reliance on public assistance. In fact, the majority of public assistance in the United States, about 55%, now goes to working families. So sometimes, just as a note, sometimes you hear higher numbers of teenagers, and the discrepancy there is if you look at the BLS website, as mentioned, that is people who earn exactly the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, not 5 cents above it or 10 cents above it. And so we're looking at is when you bring it out to who will be affected by a minimum wage increase, then you see a population that is even less, even there, very fewer teenagers, but isn't even an older workforce. So how do we account for this change? I mean, part of it, we know the story around decline in manufacturing, decline in unionization. What's interesting, in more recent years, what seems to be driving things is much less a change in the mix of industries in our economy, but actually reduction in real wages within industries and within occupations. And what that tells us is you can't explain this by technological change and it's just different jobs. What you really have to look at here is firms have gained greater market power over workers. And what that means in that context, lowering unemployment, tightening the labor market, that'll help bring wages up some, but the market is not going to solve the problem of low-wage work on its own. You can't address this without looking at policy solutions, and the proposed legislation in terms of looking at raising the minimum wage is an important part and one of the pieces of solutions that can look at addressing these issues. Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you. My name's Michael Reich. I'm a longtime professor of economics at UC Berkeley, and as Senator Leno said, the director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. That means I'm Ken's boss, and very happy to have him. I've been working on low-wage labor markets since I was in graduate school at Harvard when Lyndon Johnson was president. The problems have only gotten worse since then, so I don't know if I've had much impact. But I have recently on minimum wage academic studies. The studies that the Goldman Sachs people referred to were my studies, mine and my co-authors, which have changed the opinions of most economists, many economists anyway, about the effects of minimum wages on employment, showing they actually don't have much effect when you do the studies correctly. What I want to talk about, of course, is SB 3 today. I've co-authored a policy research brief that examines the effects of SB 3 that came out last year, along with Sylvia Allegretto, and I'm going to summarize some of that today. I'm also the co-author with Ken Jacobs of a study we just released about Los Angeles' proposal to raise the minimum wage there to $13.25 in 2017, very similar dates and so on, and many other studies of the effects of proposed or actual minimum wage increases coming along in the large cities in California. So the highlights from these studies are, and I'm going to skip the part of my testimony about how real wages have declined and so on, because the senators and Ken have already addressed this, as well as who would get the increases, and start with the fact that we calculated about 35% of all California workers would get an increase under SB 3. That's a very large number, and it's larger than minimum wage increases number affected by minimum wage increases prior in this country. And that's very bold, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it means that the previous research, we have to be a little bit careful extrapolating from it, because it was not studying minimum wage increases that were quite as big. So we've taken a very different route in our studies to estimate what the effects would be for SB 3, but building on the previous research too. We find that the most affected industries are going to be restaurants, hotel, and retail, and that businesses will mainly adjust to these increases by reducing turnover costs. Workers won't quit as often. They'll stay longer. They'll be more productive. This will save employees recruitment and retention costs, which would themselves absorb the savings, about 15% of the increased payroll, increased wage bill. And this is based on academic studies I've done, but other people have done also, where we know it's not just correlation, but causality from the wage increase to the decline in turnover. The rest of the costs that the businesses face will be primarily absorbed, we think, through price increases, small price increases, about 0.5% overall, based on our our Los Angeles study. That's over 2 years, over 2016 and 2017. Prices, as you know, have been increasing about 2.4% in recent years, and would continue to do that if you take out fuel, which is very volatile, so-called core inflation rate. And, what are the effects on the economy of California as a whole? As Senator Leno mentioned, when you increase workers' earnings, you're going to increase consumer spending directly and within the state. On the other hand, the higher prices that employers, businesses will charge will reduce consumer spending a bit because we spend a little less when prices are higher. That's, it's how it works. But by a somewhat smaller amount, the decrease would be somewhat smaller than the increase caused by the wage increases. So on net, and this is a very rough calculation, I have to work on much more to be more confident of it, I think that the California economy would be boosted by about 0.1% of its GDP and employment when you put these two sides of the ledger together. It might be a little bit more than that, but it's not going to be a huge increase, most likely. It's not going to be 10%. On the other hand, SB 3 will have very large positive effects on California's state budget. And our study of this question was the first to look at how minimum wages affect state budgets. So over the 2-year period, 2016 and 2017, we find that the state would have to pay higher wages for some of the low-wage workers who are under $13 today, especially IHS workers and DDS, the Department of Development Services workers. And together with increased contractor outlays, we think that will amount to about $2 billion over the 2 years. So that's the increase in costs. On the other hand, there'll be savings, particularly in the Medi-Cal program, which has grown so much more quickly than people expected it to. And that the savings come about, even though the program is growing, because when you have a minimum wage, many of the Medi-Cal enrollees will now be covered by the ACA, American Affordable Care Act, Medicaid coverage, which means the feds pay virtually all of the costs, whereas under traditional Medicaid, Medi-Cal, the state pays half of the costs. So the shifting of these costs, which, by the way, the feds would still save on because food stamp expenditures in the state would go down. So it wouldn't affect the federal best deficit or budget very much, but it would. This shift in how Medi-Cal enrollees are paid for would save the state, we think, at $1.5 billion in 2016 and 2017, a pretty large number. And then there's a tax increase, the increase in tax revenue in the state income tax and state sales tax, and we estimate that would increase the SB3 would increase revenue by about $2.6 billion. So when you add up the increased costs for the salaries, the IHS and the DDS especially, the lower expenses for Medi-Cal, and the increased income and sales tax revenue, and if I did my arithmetic right, which I hope I did, then the state budget would realize net gains of about $2.1 billion in 2016 and 17 under SB 3. Yeah, when I mentioned this at a private meeting with Governor Brown, he said, yeah, he'd like a free $1 billion too. And I've sent him these calculations. So in summary, the minimum wage will help people whose income, whose standard of living has been declining and who really can't meet costs, their expenses on their own. It will have some modest effects on business, which I think will be absorbed, as I say, mainly through turnover reductions and increased prices, it will have a very small effect on the California economy, certainly not a negative effect, won't harm the economy, and it will have very large positive effects on the state's budget. Thank you.
I have a question for you, unless any questions from the committee yet? When you looked at your study, did you look at, I know there's some concerns that was raised to me through the process. Small businesses, did you look at all businesses across the board? Did you look in particularly how this would affect small businesses in our community? Because
Yeah.
I remember, even though the big employers seem to have a concern, but I know that the smaller businesses do seem to be approaching us more often than not, telling us
right.
this really hurts us. So what in your studies, how would you,
Yeah.
what did you come
We
across?
looked at small businesses in our LA report, particularly. I think there are a couple of issues here. Small businesses tend to have less of a reserve. You know, they're not big corporations, so they are, in that sense, more vulnerable. And I'm not saying there would be no disemployment effects for individual businesses, but on net, there would not be. So some businesses might go out of business, but 10% of small businesses are failing every year. And what you really have to look at is not the number who fail, but the number who also, number of new businesses are created, and see whether these are related to minimum wages as opposed to the state of the economy and so on. So there is some vulnerability. On the other hand, a lot of these small businesses are in restaurants, because restaurants are mainly small business. Some are retail, grocery stores, and so on. And I think they would be able to have price increases. That small business people especially are very anxious because they see the business from their own standpoint and not understanding very easily that the minimum wage will affect all businesses, so all of them will be able to raise their prices, even if it's not that the individual one will all of a sudden become uncompetitive. Finally, we did some analysis by, like you say, by district, a neighborhood for Los Angeles, and it's kind of obvious that people who are paid low wages live in low-income districts, neighborhoods. They're not spread out evenly. And that means that the impact of the minimum wage is also, the positive impact, is concentrated in those same neighborhoods, in the poorest neighborhoods, in South LA, for example. And that means that there's going to be a tremendous economic development impact in those neighborhoods of these minimum wage increases, which will increase the market, the sales for the small businesses in those areas.
You said so their higher salaries or their higher wages will actually allow them to pay higher prices for dining at a local small restaurant or shopping at a small store.
Yeah, more than that, because you'll have this will be so concentrated that there are multiplier effects within these neighborhoods. At the same time, people who do most of the consumption in the United States are the people who have the most income, right? And so the costs of these higher prices actually would be borne more by in the more affluent areas, whether it's San Francisco or Los Angeles or any other part of the state.